Have you ever wondered what really happened during the 40 lost years of Moses' life? The Bible tells us he fled Egypt as a fugitive and ended up in Midian, but then it skips ahead 4 decades with barely a whisper about what transpired during those missing years. What was Moses doing all that time? Was he simply tending sheep and living quietly in the desert? Or was there something far more profound unfolding in the wilderness? Most people assume Moses was just hiding out, waiting for his moment to return. But what if I told you that those 40 years in Midian weren't wasted time at all? What if they were the most crucial period of preparation in biblical history? What if the man who would eventually stand before Pharaoh and demand the freedom of an entire nation was being forged in ways we've never fully understood? The silence surrounding Moses' Midian years isn't accidental. It's strategic. And when you dig deeper into the ancient texts, archaeological evidence, and cultural context of that time period, a shocking truth emerges. Those missing decades reveal a story of transformation so radical, so complete, that it challenges everything we thought we knew about one of history's greatest leaders. Before we dive into the mysteries hidden in those 40 years, leave a 777 in the comments if you're ready to discover what the Bible doesn't explicitly tell us about Moses' time in Midian. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to learn will completely change how you see the greatest Exodus story ever told. The journey begins with blood on Moses' hands and terror in his heart. Picture this: a Hebrew prince raised in Egyptian luxury suddenly becomes a wanted man. In a moment of righteous fury, Moses strikes down an Egyptian taskmaster who was beating a Hebrew slave. But instead of gratitude from his people, he finds rejection. Instead of justice, he finds himself fleeing for his life across the scorching desert. This wasn't just a geographical journey from Egypt to Midian. This was the beginning of the most dramatic personal transformation in biblical history. The man who fled Egypt was not the same man who would return 4 decades later. Something happened in those missing years, something profound, something that would prepare him to become the deliverer of an entire nation. When Moses first arrives in Midian, he's exhausted, alone, and probably questioning everything he thought he knew about his purpose. He sits by a well, which in ancient times was more than just a source of water. Wells were meeting places, centers of community life, places where destinies were often decided. And it was at this well that Moses' new life would begin to take shape. The daughters of Jethro, the priest of Midian, arrive to water their father's flocks. But they're driven away by aggressive shepherds who refuse to let them access the well. Moses, despite being a stranger and a fugitive, steps in to defend them. This single act reveals something crucial about his character that would define his entire ministry. Even in his lowest moment, even when he had every reason to keep his head down and avoid trouble, Moses couldn't stand by and watch injustice unfold. But here's where the story gets interesting. Jethro wasn't just any priest. He was the priest of Midian, a figure of significant authority and wisdom in the region. The Midianites weren't pagans worshipping false gods. They were descendants of Abraham through his wife Keturah, and they maintained a form of worship of the true God. This means Moses didn't just stumble into any random desert tribe. He was providentially placed with people who could teach him things about faith and leadership that he never could have learned in the Egyptian court. Think about what this means. Moses spent his first 40 years learning the wisdom of Egypt, arguably the most advanced civilization of its time. He was educated in their sciences, their mathematics, their engineering, their military tactics. But all of that knowledge, as impressive as it was, wasn't enough to prepare him for the task that lay ahead. He needed something more. He needed desert wisdom. He needed to understand the God of his fathers in a way that went far beyond academic knowledge. The marriage to Zipporah, Jethro's daughter, wasn't just a romantic union. It was a strategic alliance that gave Moses access to the inner circles of Midianite society. Through this relationship, he gained insights into desert survival, tribal dynamics, and most importantly, the ancient traditions that had been passed down through generations of Abraham's descendants. These weren't the corrupted traditions of Egypt or the emerging practices of other pagan nations. These were the pure, undiluted memories of the patriarchs. During those early years in Midian, Moses learned to navigate the complex social structures of nomadic life. He discovered how to read the desert, how to find water in seemingly barren landscapes, how to protect flocks from predators, both animal and human. But more than that, he was learning patience. The man who had acted impulsively in Egypt, striking down the Egyptian in a moment of anger, was being taught the value of waiting for divine timing. Archaeological evidence suggests that during this period, the Midianites were far from primitive nomads. They were skilled metalworkers, particularly known for their copper mining operations in the region. This means Moses likely gained exposure to metallurgy and engineering on a scale that would later prove invaluable when it came time to construct the tabernacle and its intricate furnishings. The golden calf incident also takes on new meaning when you realize Moses would have understood exactly how such an idol was crafted and why it was so appealing to people familiar with Egyptian religious practices. But perhaps the most significant aspect of Moses' Midian years was his relationship with his father-in-law Jethro. This wasn't just a typical family relationship. Jethro was a priest, a keeper of ancient wisdom, a man who understood both the practical and spiritual dimensions of leadership. Under Jethro's guidance, Moses began to develop the administrative skills that would later enable him to organize and lead a nation of over 2 million people through the wilderness. The Bible gives us glimpses of Jethro's wisdom later in the story when he visits Moses during the wilderness wanderings and suggests the establishment of a judicial system with judges over thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. But this wisdom wasn't developed overnight. It was the result of decades of mentorship, observation, and practical application in the day-to-day governance of Midianite tribal life. As the years passed, Moses wasn't just surviving in the desert. He was thriving. He was becoming someone entirely different from the impulsive prince who had fled Egypt. The desert was stripping away everything that was merely Egyptian about him and revealing the Hebrew heart that had always been there. But it was doing more than that. It was preparing him for encounters with the divine that would have destroyed the younger, less prepared version of himself. Consider the physical transformation alone. 40 years of desert life would have hardened Moses' body, deepened his understanding of survival, and given him an intimate knowledge of the very wilderness where he would later lead the Israelites. Every canyon, every water source, every dangerous passage would have become familiar to him. When the time came to guide millions through this harsh landscape, Moses wouldn't be consulting maps or relying on guides. He would be drawing on 4 decades of personal experience, but the spiritual transformation was even more profound. The Egyptian court had taught Moses about power, politics, and human wisdom. But the Midian wilderness was teaching him about surrender, dependence, and divine wisdom. The man who had once commanded servants and lived in luxury was learning to find contentment in simplicity. The prince who had been surrounded by the splendor of Pharaoh's palace was discovering that true wealth couldn't be measured in gold and precious stones. The flocks that Moses tended weren't just sheep and goats. They were a living metaphor for the people he would one day shepherd. Every day spent protecting them from predators, leading them to water, and guiding them to safe pasture was preparation for the greater pastoral calling that awaited him. The patience required to work with stubborn, wandering, vulnerable creatures was exactly the patience he would need when dealing with the children of Israel. Yet for all this preparation, Moses himself seemed unaware of what was being accomplished in his life. The Bible suggests that he had settled into this new existence, perhaps even accepting that his days of significance were behind him. He had named his first son Gershom, meaning, "I have been a stranger in a foreign land," indicating that he still saw himself as an exile rather than someone being prepared for greatness. This sense of being forgotten of being set aside, was itself part of the preparation. The man who would eventually confront the most powerful ruler on earth needed to first learn humility in obscurity. He needed to discover that his identity and worth weren't tied to position or recognition, but to something far deeper and more eternal. As Moses entered his 70s, he probably assumed his story was nearly over. He had found peace in Midian, had raised a family, had learned to be content with a quiet life, tending flocks in the wilderness. The burning ambitions of his youth had cooled, replaced by the steady rhythms of pastoral life. But what Moses didn't realize was that all of this apparent obscurity, all of these seemingly mundane experiences, had been orchestrated by a divine hand that was preparing him for the most extraordinary calling in human history. The desert hadn't diminished Moses. It had refined him. The years hadn't weakened him. They had strengthened him in ways that mattered far more than physical power or political influence. The silence hadn't been God's absence. It had been God's presence working in ways too deep and too mysterious for Moses to fully comprehend. And then came the day that would change everything. A day when an ordinary morning of leading sheep to pasture would become the most extraordinary encounter between heaven and earth. A day when 40 years of preparation would suddenly make perfect sense. A day when the burning bush would reveal that every moment of those missing years had been leading to this single, world-changing moment. But before that burning bush encounter that would define Moses' destiny, something else was happening in those final years in Midian that most people completely overlook. Moses wasn't just becoming a better shepherd or learning desert survival skills. He was being initiated into mysteries that would prove absolutely essential for what lay ahead. You see, Jethro wasn't just any priest. Ancient traditions suggest he was a keeper of secrets that stretched back to the very beginning of time. The Midianites, as descendants of Abraham, had preserved knowledge that had been passed down through generations. Knowledge about the nature of God, about spiritual warfare, about the unseen realm that most people never even suspect exists. Think about it. When Moses would later stand before Pharaoh, he wouldn't just be facing a political leader. He would be confronting the spiritual powers of Egypt, a nation whose entire religious system was built on demonic deception, disguised as divine wisdom. The plagues that would devastate Egypt weren't just natural disasters. They were surgical strikes against specific Egyptian gods, each one designed to expose the powerlessness of false deities. But how did Moses know which gods to target? How did he understand the spiritual hierarchy of Egyptian religion well enough to systematically dismantle it? The answer lies in those missing years with Jethro. The old priest had been teaching Moses not just about leadership and desert survival, but about the invisible war between light and darkness that has been raging since the fall of man. Consider the rod that would become Moses' instrument of miraculous power. Where did it come from? The Bible mentions it almost casually, as if every shepherd carried a staff capable of parting seas and bringing forth water from rocks. But this was no ordinary piece of wood. Ancient sources suggest it was a rod with a history, possibly connected to the patriarchs themselves, passed down through generations, and somehow ending up in Jethro's possession. During those decades in Midian, Moses was being trained in the use of this rod, learning to channel divine power through it in ways that would have been impossible without years of practice and preparation. The miracles we see during the Exodus didn't happen because Moses suddenly received magical abilities. They happened because he had spent decades learning to cooperate with divine power in ways that few human beings ever achieve. But there's something even more shocking about Moses' Midian years that most people never consider. What if Moses wasn't the only Hebrew in exile there? What if Midian had become a refuge for others who had fled Egyptian oppression over the years? Archaeological evidence suggests that the Midianites maintained extensive trade networks and had connections throughout the ancient Near East. It's entirely possible that Moses encountered other Hebrews during his time there, people who had escaped slavery and found new lives in the desert. These encounters would have given Moses invaluable intelligence about conditions in Egypt, about the growing oppression of his people, about the desperation that was building among the Hebrew slaves. He wouldn't have been operating in a vacuum when he finally returned to Egypt. He would have been drawing on decades of first-hand accounts from people who had experienced Egyptian brutality and lived to tell about it. This also explains why Moses seemed to understand Hebrew culture and religion so thoroughly, despite spending his first 40 years in Egyptian courts. His Midian years weren't just about learning desert wisdom. They were about reconnecting with his Hebrew identity in ways that went far deeper than blood ancestry. He was learning the stories, the traditions, the hopes and dreams of a people he had been called to deliver. The more you examine those missing years, the more you realize they weren't missing at all. They were hidden, tucked away in divine providence, shielded from the eyes of historians and casual readers, because what was happening there was too sacred, too important, too strategically crucial to be exposed to public scrutiny. Think about the timing. Moses fled Egypt as a young man full of passion, but lacking wisdom. He needed exactly 40 years to be transformed from an impulsive prince into a seasoned leader, capable of handling the enormous challenges that lay ahead. Not 39 years, not 41 years, exactly 40 years. This wasn't coincidence. This was divine precision. During his final decade in Midian, as Moses entered his 70s, something began to shift in the spiritual atmosphere. The cries of the Hebrew slaves in Egypt were reaching a crescendo. The time of deliverance that had been prophesied to Abraham was drawing near, and Moses, though he didn't yet know it, was about to graduate from the most intensive leadership development program in human history. But even as that momentous day approached, Moses remained unaware of his destiny. He had grown comfortable in his role as shepherd and family man. He had found peace in the rhythms of a desert life. The fire that had once burned in him to deliver his people had cooled to barely glowing embers. This too was part of the preparation. The man who would confront Pharaoh needed to be operating not from personal ambition, but from pure obedience to divine calling. The sheep that Moses tended during those final years were teaching him lessons he would desperately need when leading the children of Israel. Sheep are notoriously stubborn, prone to wandering, quick to panic, and completely dependent on their shepherd for survival. Every day spent managing their behavior, protecting them from predators, and guiding them to safety was preparation for managing a nation of former slaves who would prove just as challenging to lead. Moses was also learning the geography of the wilderness in intimate detail. Every mountain, every valley, every oasis would later become strategically important during the 40-year journey from Egypt to the Promised Land. When the time came to choose camping sites, find water sources, and navigate treacherous terrain, Moses would be drawing on decades of personal experience rather than theoretical knowledge. But perhaps most importantly, those final years in Midian were teaching Moses about the character of God in ways that would prove absolutely essential for what lay ahead. The God he would encounter at the burning bush wasn't a stranger. He was the same God Moses had been learning to trust through years of quiet faithfulness in the desert. The voice that would commission him to return to Egypt was the same voice that had been guiding him through decades of preparation, even when he wasn't aware of it. As Moses approached his 80th birthday, he had no idea that his real life's work was about to begin. He had no clue that all the experiences of the past 4 decades had been carefully orchestrated to prepare him for the most audacious rescue mission in human history. He couldn't have imagined that the quiet shepherd's life he had built in Midian was about to be completely upended by a divine encounter that would change everything. The man who had once been Prince Moses of Egypt, who had then become Moses the fugitive, and who had spent 40 years as Moses the shepherd, was about to discover his true identity. He was about to learn that he was Moses the deliverer, chosen before his birth, prepared through every experience of his life, and about to be launched into a destiny that would echo through eternity. But first would come the test. The moment when everything he had learned, everything he had become, everything he had endured would be put to the ultimate examination. The moment when a simple shepherd's day would become the pivot point of human history. The moment when 40 years of preparation would finally make perfect sense. Standing at the edge of this transformation, Moses had no idea what was coming. He was simply doing what he had done thousands of times before, leading his flock to pasture in the wilderness. But this day would be different. This day, the ordinary would become extraordinary. This day, the hidden years would be revealed as the most crucial preparation period in biblical history. The burning bush was waiting. The voice of the Almighty was about to break the silence. And Moses, shaped and refined by 40 years of divine preparation, was finally ready for the encounter that would launch the greatest deliverance story ever told. The burning bush encounter wasn't just a random divine visitation. It was the culmination of 40 years of meticulous preparation. And when you understand what was really happening in that moment, it becomes clear that every detail of Moses' Midian years had been building toward this single, world-changing conversation. Picture the scene. Moses is leading his flock to the far side of the desert, to Horeb, the mountain of God. But this wasn't just any ordinary day of shepherding. Something had drawn him to this specific location, at this specific time, for this specific encounter. The Hebrew text suggests that Moses had been here before, that this mountain held significance in his spiritual development during those missing years. Horeb wasn't just called the mountain of God by accident. Ancient traditions indicate that this was a place where the divine presence had been encountered by others throughout history. Some scholars believe it was here that Jethro had taught Moses about the deeper mysteries of faith, about the nature of the God who had called Abraham and established his covenant with the patriarchs. If this is true, then the burning bush encounter wasn't happening in unfamiliar territory. It was happening in a place that had become sacred to Moses through years of prayer, meditation, and spiritual instruction. When Moses sees the bush burning, but not being consumed, his response reveals something crucial about how those 40 years had changed him. The impulsive young prince who had struck down the Egyptian might have rushed forward immediately, but the seasoned shepherd knew how to observe, how to wait, how to approach mysteries with proper reverence. His decision to turn aside and investigate wasn't reckless curiosity. It was the measured response of a man who had learned to recognize the supernatural when he encountered it. But here's what most people miss about the burning bush. It wasn't just a spectacular visual display designed to get Moses' attention. It was a profound theological statement about what was about to happen in Egypt. The bush burned but wasn't consumed, just as the Hebrew people had been oppressed for centuries but hadn't been destroyed. The fire represented both the trials they had endured and the divine presence that had preserved them through those trials. Moses would have understood this symbolism immediately because of his Midian education. Jethro had taught him to read the language of divine signs, to understand that God doesn't just communicate through words, but through symbols, patterns, and miraculous displays that carry layers of meaning. The burning bush wasn't just calling Moses to a mission. It was revealing the nature of that mission and the God who was sending him. When God calls Moses by name from the bush, the response is immediate. Here I am. This wasn't the response of a man meeting God for the first time. This was the response of someone who had been in relationship with the Almighty for years, even if he hadn't fully understood the depth of that relationship. The voice speaking from the bush was familiar to Moses because it was the same voice that had been guiding him through every experience of the past 4 decades. The command to remove his sandals because he was standing on holy ground reveals something profound about Moses' spiritual maturity. without hesitation, without question, he obeys. This immediate, unquestioning obedience wasn't natural to the Moses who had fled Egypt. It was the fruit of 40 years of learning to submit to divine authority, of discovering that God's ways are always higher than human ways, of understanding that true strength comes through surrender rather than self-assertion. When God identifies himself as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Moses hides his face because he's afraid to look upon God. But this fear isn't the terror of a stranger encountering an unknown deity. It's the reverent awe of a man who finally understands the magnitude of who he's been in relationship with all these years. The God who had been preparing him in the wilderness was the same God who had made promises to his ancestors, the same God who was now ready to fulfill those promises through him. The conversation that follows reveals just how thoroughly Moses had been prepared for this moment. When God explains the mission to deliver the Israelites from Egypt, Moses doesn't question whether it's possible. He questions whether he's the right person for the job. This shift from questioning God's power to questioning his own worthiness shows the depth of humility that had been developed during those Midian years. God's response to Moses' objections is fascinating because it reveals that every concern Moses raises has already been addressed through his 40 years of preparation. When Moses says he's nobody special, God promises to be with him. When Moses worries that the people won't believe him, God gives him miraculous signs. When Moses claims he can't speak well, God reminds him that the creator of mouths can certainly enable speech. Every objection Moses raises is met with an answer that draws on capabilities and experiences he had gained during his time in Midian. The rod that becomes the instrument of miraculous power takes on new significance when you realize it had been in Moses' hand for decades. This wasn't a magic wand suddenly granted supernatural properties. It was a tool he had used daily for 40 years, a familiar object that would now become the channel through which divine power would flow. The transformation of the rod from a simple shepherd's staff into an instrument of miracles symbolizes the transformation of Moses himself from a simple shepherd into the deliverer of nations. But there's something even more remarkable about this encounter that most people completely overlook. The burning bush conversation wasn't just about commissioning Moses for ministry. It was about revealing his true identity in ways that connected every experience of his life into a coherent whole. The Prince of Egypt, the Hebrew by birth, the shepherd of Midian, and now the deliverer of Israel weren't separate identities. They were all aspects of the same divinely orchestrated life story. God's declaration that he had heard the cries of his people and remembered his covenant reveals why the timing of this encounter was so precise. The 40 years Moses spent in preparation weren't arbitrary. They corresponded exactly to the time needed for conditions in Egypt to reach the breaking point, for the Hebrew population to grow to the size necessary for nationhood, and for political circumstances to align in ways that would make the exodus possible. When God tells Moses to return to Egypt, the command comes with a promise that all the men who sought his life are dead. This wasn't just practical information. It was confirmation that the timing was perfect, that the fears that had driven Moses into exile were no longer relevant, and that the season of preparation was complete. The man who had fled Egypt as a fugitive was being invited to return as a liberator. The reluctance Moses shows throughout this conversation isn't weakness or lack of faith. It's the response of a man who fully understands the magnitude of what's being asked of him. 40 years of desert life had taught him about the cost of leadership, the weight of responsibility, and the reality that God's calls are never easy to fulfill. His hesitation demonstrates wisdom rather than cowardice. But perhaps most significantly, the burning bush encounter reveals that Moses' sense of inadequacy was actually part of his preparation. The man who would stand before Pharaoh and demand the release of millions of slaves needed to understand that his power came not from personal strength, but from divine enablement. The years in Midian had stripped away every source of confidence except confidence in God. And that was exactly what was needed for the task ahead. When Moses finally accepts the commission and prepares to leave Midian, he's not the same man who arrived there 40 years earlier. He's been transformed from the inside out, equipped with every skill and character quality necessary for the impossible task that lies ahead. The desert years weren't a detour from his destiny. They were the pathway to it. The conversation with Jethro about leaving Midian takes on new meaning when you understand what Moses had learned during his time there. He wasn't just saying goodbye to his father-in-law. He was expressing gratitude to the man who had served as his mentor, guide, and spiritual father during the most formative period of his life. Jethro's blessing on the journey wasn't just polite courtesy. It was the commissioning of a spiritual son who was ready to fulfill his calling. As Moses gathered his family and prepared to return to Egypt, he was carrying more than personal belongings. He was carrying 40 years of accumulated wisdom, experience, and spiritual maturity. The shy shepherd's staff in his hand had become the rod of God. The man who had once acted impulsively out of personal anger was now moving in perfect obedience to divine timing. The journey back to Egypt wasn't just a geographical return. It was the completion of a circle that had begun when Moses first felt stirring in his heart to help his oppressed people. But now, instead of acting out of human compassion and personal strength, he was moving in divine power with supernatural authority. The difference between these two approaches would make all the difference in the world. When Moses crossed the border from Midian back into Egypt, he was no longer Moses the fugitive or Moses the shepherd. He was Moses the deliverer, equipped, prepared, and empowered for the greatest rescue mission in human history. Every step of those 40 missing years had been leading to this moment. Every lesson learned, every skill developed, every character quality refined was about to be put to the ultimate test. The man who would soon stand before Pharaoh and declare, "Let my people go," had been 40 years in the making. And as he approached the land of his birth with his family, his rod, and his divine commission, Moses finally understood that those weren't missing years at all. They were the most important years of his life, the years that had transformed him from a prince with good intentions into a leader with divine authority. But the real test was just beginning. Everything Moses had learned in the wilderness was about to be put into practice in the most challenging circumstances imaginable. The quiet years of preparation were over. The time for action had arrived, and thanks to those 40 years of divine education in the desert, Moses was finally ready for everything that lay ahead. The stage was set, the deliverer was prepared, and the greatest Exodus story in human history was about to begin. But it would never have been possible without those shocking, transformative, absolutely essential missing years in Midian. The return journey to Egypt wasn't just a physical transition from one land to another. It was the moment when 40 years of hidden preparation would finally be put to the test. But as Moses traveled with his family along the desert roads that would take them back to the land of his birth, something extraordinary was happening in the spiritual realm that most people never consider. You see, Moses wasn't returning to the same Egypt he had left 4 decades earlier. The nation had changed, the political landscape had shifted, and most importantly, the spiritual atmosphere had intensified in ways that would require every ounce of the wisdom and power he had gained during his Midian years. The Pharaoh who now sat on the throne wasn't the same ruler who had sought Moses' life. This was likely Ramesses II, a man whose ego and ambition had reached legendary proportions. He had built monuments to himself throughout Egypt, expanded the empire's borders through military conquest, and established a reign of oppression over the Hebrew slaves that surpassed anything his predecessors had attempted. This wasn't just political tyranny, it was spiritual warfare on a scale that demanded supernatural intervention. But here's what's truly remarkable. Moses was returning with more than just a divine commission. He was carrying the accumulated spiritual authority of 4 decades spent in intimate relationship with the Almighty. Every prayer offered in the Midian wilderness, every moment of communion with God while tending flocks, every lesson learned about divine timing and supernatural power had been building toward this confrontation. The first test came before Moses even reached Egypt. In one of the most mysterious passages in all of Scripture, we're told that God met Moses at a lodging place and sought to kill him. This terrifying encounter, which ended only when Zipporah circumcised their son, reveals something crucial about the level of spiritual preparation required for what lay ahead. God wasn't trying to destroy Moses. He was testing whether the man who would demand that Pharaoh release the Hebrews was himself fully committed to Hebrew covenant practices. The circumcision of Moses' son wasn't just a religious ritual. It was a declaration that Moses was completely aligned with the covenant people he was called to deliver. No compromise would be tolerated. No shortcuts would be accepted. The deliverer of Israel had to be authentically, completely, unreservedly Hebrew in his covenant commitment. This encounter also reveals the depth of spiritual warfare that surrounded Moses' mission. The forces of darkness understood what was at stake. If Moses succeeded in delivering the Hebrews from Egypt, it would be a devastating blow to the kingdom of Satan. The entire occult system that undergirded Egyptian power would be exposed as powerless. The demonic principalities that ruled through Pharaoh would be humiliated before the nations of the earth. When Moses finally arrives in Egypt, his first task isn't to confront Pharaoh. It's to convince his own people that deliverance has arrived. But even this seemingly simple assignment reveals how thoroughly his Midian years had prepared him for leadership challenges. The Hebrew slaves had been in bondage for centuries. They had grown accustomed to oppression, resigned to their fate, suspicious of anyone promising freedom. Moses' approach to this challenge demonstrates the wisdom he had gained from Jethro about managing people's expectations and building consensus for difficult decisions. He doesn't just announce that he's their deliverer. He performs the miraculous signs God had given him, transforming his rod into a serpent, making his hand leprous and then healing it, turning water into blood. These weren't just spectacular displays of power. They were carefully chosen demonstrations designed to overcome specific objections and fears. The rod becoming a serpent was particularly significant because serpents were symbols of royal power in Egyptian culture. Every pharaoh wore the cobra crown as a sign of his authority. When Moses' rod swallowed the rods of Pharaoh's magicians during their later confrontation, it was a declaration that Hebrew authority was superior to Egyptian power. But Moses understood this symbolism because of his education in both Egyptian courts and Midianite wisdom traditions. The hand becoming leprous and then being healed spoke directly to the Hebrews' fear that they were permanently marked by their slave status, that freedom was impossible for people in their condition. The miraculous healing demonstrated that God could transform any situation, no matter how hopeless it appeared. This wasn't just a magic trick. It was a theological statement about the nature of divine redemption. The water turning to blood foreshadowed the first plague that would devastate Egypt, but it also carried deeper meaning. Blood represented life in Hebrew culture, but it also represented judgment. The sign was simultaneously a promise of life for the Hebrews and a warning of judgment for their oppressors. When the Hebrew elders saw these signs, they believed and worshipped. But their belief was fragile, based more on desperation than deep faith. Moses knew from his years of shepherding that initial enthusiasm often fades when difficulties arise. The people who cheered his arrival would soon be questioning his leadership when Pharaoh increased their burdens in response to the demand for freedom. This is where Moses' desert training became absolutely crucial. The patience he had learned while dealing with stubborn sheep translated perfectly to managing a nation of frightened former slaves. The persistence he had developed through years of desert survival prepared him for the long campaign that would be required to break Pharaoh's resistance. The humility he had cultivated through decades of obscurity enabled him to handle both criticism from his people and opposition from the most powerful ruler on earth. But perhaps most importantly, the intimate relationship with God that Moses had developed during his Midian years gave him access to divine strategy and supernatural power that would prove essential for the battles ahead. This wasn't just about leading a slave revolt. It was about demonstrating the supremacy of the true God over all the false deities of Egypt. The 10 plagues that would devastate Egypt weren't random displays of divine wrath. They were surgical strikes against specific Egyptian gods, each one designed to expose the powerlessness of the entire Egyptian pantheon. The Nile turning to blood, humiliated Hapi, the god of the Nile. The plague of frogs mocked Heket, the frog-headed goddess of fertility. The plague of gnats demonstrated that Egyptian priests, who had to be ceremonially clean to serve their gods, couldn't even protect themselves from tiny insects. Each plague built upon the previous one, creating mounting pressure on Pharaoh while systematically destroying the spiritual foundations of Egyptian society. But this sophisticated campaign of spiritual warfare required someone who understood both Egyptian religion and Hebrew theology at the deepest levels. Moses' unique background, enhanced by 40 years of spiritual preparation in Midian, made him the perfect instrument for this unprecedented confrontation. The hardening of Pharaoh's heart, which many people struggle to understand, makes perfect sense when you realize what was really happening. God wasn't preventing Pharaoh from choosing freely. He was ensuring that the contest between Hebrew truth and Egyptian deception would be complete and decisive. Every Egyptian god would be given the opportunity to demonstrate its power. Every form of occult resistance would be allowed to manifest. And then, when all of Egypt's spiritual resources had been exhausted, the superiority of the God of Israel would be undeniably established. Moses' role in this cosmic confrontation required nerves of steel, unshakable faith, and the ability to function under pressure that would have crushed most people. But 40 years of desert training had prepared him for exactly these conditions. The man who had learned to find water in barren places could trust God to provide miraculous solutions to impossible problems. The shepherd who had protected his flocks from predators could stand fearlessly before the most dangerous ruler on earth. As the plagues intensified and Egyptian resistance began to crumble, Moses demonstrated another quality that had been developed during his Midian years: the ability to show mercy even to enemies. When Pharaoh begged him to stop the plague of flies, Moses didn't gloat or demand additional concessions. He simply interceded with God for relief, demonstrating the heart of a true leader who takes no pleasure in necessary judgment. This compassionate authority, this combination of strength and mercy, hadn't developed overnight. It was the fruit of 4 decades spent learning to balance justice and grace in his daily interactions with people and animals under his care. The desert had taught Moses that true power lies not in domination, but in service, not in crushing opponents, but in accomplishing divine purposes with minimal necessary force. The Passover night, when death visited every Egyptian household but passed over Hebrew homes marked with lamb's blood, represented the culmination of everything Moses had learned about faith, obedience, and divine protection. The detailed instructions for the Passover meal, the specific requirements for the lamb, the precise application of blood to doorposts and lintels, all demonstrated the kind of meticulous attention to divine commands that Moses had learned during his years of following God's guidance in the wilderness. But the Passover also revealed something profound about Moses' understanding of substitutionary sacrifice. The innocent lamb dying in place of the firstborn wasn't just a practical solution to the problem of judgment. It was a prophetic picture of the ultimate sacrifice that would one day be offered for the sins of the world. Moses' education in Midianite worship traditions which maintained memories of patriarchal sacrificial practices, had prepared him to understand and communicate these deep theological truths. When Pharaoh finally released the Hebrews after the death of his own firstborn son, it wasn't just a political decision, it was the acknowledgement of defeat in a spiritual war that had been building for decades. The God King of Egypt had been proven powerless before the God of a slave people. The entire foundation of Egyptian civilization had been shattered by a shepherd with a staff and an unshakable conviction that his God was supreme. The exodus that followed wasn't just a migration of people from one land to another. It was the birth of a nation, the fulfillment of promises made centuries earlier to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But it was also the vindication of 40 years of preparation that had seemed like waste to everyone except the God who was orchestrating every detail for his ultimate purposes. As Moses led millions of newly freed slaves out of Egypt, he was drawing on every skill he had developed during his desert years. The organizational abilities learned from Jethro enabled him to manage the logistics of moving such a massive population. The geographical knowledge gained from decades of shepherding provided him with intimate familiarity of the terrain they would traverse. The spiritual authority developed through years of communion with God gave him the confidence to trust divine guidance, even when human wisdom suggested different courses of action. The pillar of cloud by day and fire by night that guided the Hebrew exodus wasn't just a supernatural GPS system. It was the visible manifestation of the same divine presence that had been guiding Moses throughout his Midian years, often invisibly but always faithfully. The God who had led him to water sources and safe pastures as a shepherd was now leading an entire nation through the wilderness toward their promised inheritance. But the real test of Moses' preparation was yet to come. Leading people out of bondage was one thing. Forging them into a unified nation capable of receiving divine law and conquering promised territory would require every lesson learned during those 40 transformative years in Midian. The shy shepherd, who had questioned his own abilities at the burning bush, was about to become the lawgiver, judge, and military commander of one of history's most significant nations. The sea that blocked their path to freedom would soon part at the touch of Moses' rod. The Egyptian army that pursued them would be swallowed by waters that had been walls of protection for the Hebrews. And through it all, the man who had spent 4 decades learning to trust God in small things would demonstrate that same trust in circumstances that defied human understanding. Those weren't missing years after all. They were the most crucial years in the formation of one of history's greatest leaders. Every day of preparation had been necessary. Every lesson learned had been essential. Every moment of seeming insignificance had been building toward the most significant deliverance in human history. The shocking truth about Moses' missing years in Midian wasn't that they were wasted. It was that they were the secret to everything that followed. The man who emerged from the wilderness to confront Pharaoh wasn't the same impulsive prince who had fled Egypt in fear. He was a deliverer, refined by fire, tested by time, and prepared by providence for a destiny that would echo through eternity. But as the euphoria of the Exodus began to settle, and the reality of wilderness living set in, Moses would face challenges that would test every aspect of his 40-year preparation in ways he never could have anticipated. The people who had praised God at the Red Sea would soon be complaining about water. The nation that had witnessed the most spectacular miracles in human history would soon be longing to return to Egyptian slavery. And Moses, the deliverer who had confronted Pharaoh with supernatural boldness, would find himself caught between a holy God and a rebellious people. This is where the depth of Moses' Midian training would prove absolutely essential. You see, leading sheep through the desert had taught him something crucial about human nature that no amount of palace education could have provided. Sheep are creatures of habit who resist change even when that change leads to better pastures. They panic easily, follow poor leaders, and have remarkably short memories when it comes to past deliverances. Sound familiar? Just 3 days after crossing the Red Sea, the Israelites were complaining about bitter water at Marah. 3 days. After witnessing the 10 plagues, the death of Egypt's firstborn, the parting of the sea and the destruction of Pharaoh's army, they were ready to revolt over undrinkable water. But Moses didn't panic. His desert years had taught him that thirsty flocks often led their shepherds to water sources that appeared unusable, but could be made sweet with the right treatment. When God showed Moses the tree that would sweeten the waters of Marah, it wasn't just a miraculous solution to an immediate problem. It was a demonstration of a principle Moses had learned during his shepherding years. Apparent disasters often hide divine provisions. The bitter experiences that seem to threaten survival frequently become the very means through which God demonstrates his faithfulness. This wasn't theoretical knowledge for Moses. It was experiential wisdom gained through decades of finding God's provision in impossible circumstances. The manna that began falling from heaven shortly after the Marah incident reveals another aspect of Moses' preparation that most people completely overlook. Managing daily bread distribution for over 2 million people required organizational skills that went far beyond anything Moses could have learned in Egyptian courts or Midianite tents. This was logistics on a scale that had never been attempted in human history. But Moses approached this challenge with the same methodical patience he had learned while managing flocks. He established clear rules. Gather only what you need for today, except on the 6th day when you gather enough for the Sabbath. Don't try to hoard manna, because it will spoil. Trust God's daily provision rather than relying on your own accumulation efforts. These weren't just practical guidelines for food distribution. They were spiritual lessons about dependence, trust, and the danger of self-reliance. The people who violated these simple instructions revealed the same stubborn independence that Moses had observed in wandering sheep. Some tried to gather more than they needed, only to discover that excess manna bred worms and stank. Others ignored the Sabbath provision and went out on the 7th day to gather, only to find nothing. Every violation of God's manna rules became a teaching moment about the importance of following divine guidance rather than human wisdom. Moses' response to these violations demonstrates the patience he had developed during his desert years. He didn't rage against the people or threaten them with abandonment. Instead, he used each failure as an opportunity to reinforce the lessons God was trying to teach. This wasn't the reaction of a man learning leadership on the job. It was the response of someone who had spent 40 years discovering that gentle persistence accomplishes more than angry confrontation. The water crisis at Rephidim, where Moses struck the rock and water gushed forth, reveals yet another dimension of his Midian preparation. Desert shepherds develop an almost supernatural ability to find water in seemingly barren places. They learn to read the landscape, to recognize subtle signs that indicate hidden springs, to understand geological formations that might conceal life-saving resources. When the people quarreled with Moses about the lack of water at Rephidim, his response was telling. Instead of panicking or trying to solve the problem through human ingenuity, he immediately inquired of the Lord. This wasn't desperation. It was the conditioned response of a man who had learned to consult divine wisdom before attempting human solutions. 40 years of shepherding had taught him that the shepherd's first responsibility is to seek guidance from the ultimate shepherd. The battle with the Amalekites that followed the water miracle at Rephidim demonstrates still another aspect of Moses' comprehensive preparation. While Joshua led the military engagement in the valley, Moses positioned himself on a hilltop with the rod of God in his hands. As long as his hands remained raised, Israel prevailed. When his hands grew tired and dropped, Amalek gained the advantage. This wasn't just a dramatic prayer meeting. It was spiritual warfare at the highest level. And Moses understood exactly what was happening because of his Midian training. Jethro had taught him that battles are won or lost in the invisible realm before they're decided on physical battlefields. The raised rod wasn't a magic wand ensuring military victory. It was a symbol of dependence on divine power rather than human strength. When Moses' hands grew tired and Aaron and Hur supported them until sunset, it demonstrated another principle Moses had learned during his desert years. Effective leadership requires reliable partners who understand the spiritual dimensions of earthly challenges. This wasn't weakness on Moses' part, it was wisdom. He had discovered during his shepherding years that trying to handle every challenge alone inevitably leads to exhaustion and failure. The arrival of Jethro at the Israelite camp after the Amalekite victory provides one of the most revealing glimpses into the depth of Moses' Midian education. When Jethro observes Moses trying to judge all the disputes among 2 million people by himself, his response reveals the kind of administrative wisdom that had been shaping Moses for decades. "What you are doing is not good," Jethro declares with the authority of a spiritual father addressing his son. "You will surely wear out both yourself and these people who are with you, for the task is too heavy for you. You cannot do it alone." The solution Jethro proposes, establishing judges over thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens, wasn't a new idea he had just conceived. It was a proven organizational structure that Moses had observed and participated in throughout his years in Midian. But notice Moses' response to his father-in-law's counsel. There's no defensiveness, no insistence on maintaining control, no concern about sharing authority. Moses immediately recognizes the wisdom of Jethro's proposal and implements it without hesitation. This kind of humble teachability hadn't developed overnight. It was the fruit of 40 years spent learning from a mentor who had consistently demonstrated superior wisdom in practical matters. The establishment of this judicial system reveals something profound about the nature of Moses' preparation. He hadn't just been learning to survive in the desert or developing personal spiritual maturity. He had been studying governmental structures, administrative procedures, and leadership principles that would prove essential for managing a nation. The quiet years in Midian hadn't been a retreat from responsibility. They had been graduate-level training in the art of governance. When the Israelites finally reached Mount Sinai, the mountain where Moses had first encountered God at the burning bush, the full significance of his 40-year preparation becomes stunningly clear. This wasn't just a geographical return to a familiar location. It was the completion of a prophetic circle that had been set in motion decades earlier. The God who had called Moses from the burning bush had promised that he would return to this mountain with the people he was commissioned to deliver. Now, as millions of Hebrew ex-slaves camp in the shadow of Horeb, that promise is being fulfilled in ways that exceed every expectation. But Moses approaches this moment not as a nervous novice, but as a seasoned leader who has learned to recognize and respond to divine manifestations. The theophany that follows, the thunder, lightning, earthquake, and trumpet blast that announces God's descent upon the mountain, would have terrified most people. But Moses had been prepared for exactly this kind of encounter through his years of intimate communion with the Almighty in the Midian wilderness. While the people trembled at the base of the mountain, Moses ascended into the thick darkness where God was, demonstrating the kind of spiritual boldness that only comes from long familiarity with divine presence. The giving of the law that follows represents the culmination of Moses' transformation from Egyptian prince to Hebrew lawgiver. The 10 Commandments and the detailed statutes that accompany them weren't just moral guidelines for a new nation. They were the constitutional foundation for a theocracy unlike anything the world had ever seen. And Moses, the man who would serve as mediator between God and people, had been prepared for this role through 4 decades of learning to balance divine holiness with human frailty. The 40 days Moses spent on the mountain receiving the law weren't just an extended dictation session. They were the final phase of his preparation, The moment when everything he had learned during his Midian years was integrated into a comprehensive understanding of God's purposes for his people. The stone tablets he would carry down the mountain weren't just carved stone. They were the tangible representation of a covenant that would define Israel's relationship with God for millennia to come. But even as Moses was receiving the law on the mountain, the people below were demonstrating exactly why his 40 years of preparation had been so necessary. The golden calf incident that occurred during his absence revealed the depth of spiritual immaturity that characterized the newly liberated slaves. While their leader was meeting with God face to face, they were reverting to the pagan practices they had learned in Egypt. Moses' response when he discovered the golden calf worship demonstrates the perfect balance of righteous anger and redemptive love that had been developed during his desert years. His immediate destruction of the calf and the stone tablets wasn't uncontrolled rage. It was the measured response of a leader who understood that some situations require decisive action before restoration can begin. The intercession that followed, where Moses pleaded with God not to destroy the people despite their rebellion, reveals the pastoral heart that had been cultivated through years of caring for vulnerable flocks. "If you will not forgive their sin, blot me out from your book," Moses pleads, demonstrating the kind of sacrificial love that characterizes true leadership. This wasn't political maneuvering or emotional manipulation. It was the genuine heart cry of a shepherd willing to sacrifice himself for his sheep. The second giving of the law that follows the golden calf crisis demonstrates God's patience with both the people and their leader. When Moses ascends the mountain again to receive replacement tablets, his face begins to shine with divine glory in ways that terrify the people. This physical transformation wasn't just a supernatural phenomenon. It was the visible manifestation of what 40 years of spiritual preparation had accomplished in Moses' inner life. The veil that Moses begins wearing to shield the people from the glory reflecting from his face becomes a powerful symbol of his role as mediator. He had become someone who could stand in the presence of God without being consumed, and then return to minister to people who couldn't bear even the reflection of that glory. This unique capacity for moving between the divine and human realms was the direct result of his Midian training in spiritual sensitivity and practical leadership. As the Israelites prepare to leave Sinai and continue their journey toward the Promised Land, Moses stands before them as a completely transformed leader. The impulsive prince who had fled Egypt in fear has become the patient lawgiver who can handle rebellion without losing his vision. The man who had once doubted his ability to speak has become the eloquent spokesman who can communicate divine truth to human hearts. The shepherd who had tended flocks in obscurity has become the deliverer who has liberated a nation and established a covenant that will endure forever. The wilderness years that follow will test every aspect of Moses' preparation in new ways. The people will rebel again and again, testing his patience and challenging his authority. There will be military campaigns requiring strategic wisdom, administrative crises demanding organizational skills, and spiritual challenges that will push his faith to its limits. But through it all, Moses will draw on the deep well of experience and wisdom that was filled during those 40 crucial years in Midian. The man who emerges from this comprehensive preparation isn't just a political leader or military commander. He's a prophet, priest, and king rolled into one, the most complete leader in biblical history. His ability to function effectively in all these roles simultaneously wasn't natural talent or divine favoritism. It was the fruit of the most intensive leadership development program ever recorded. A 4-decade curriculum that prepared him for challenges no other human being has ever faced. Those missing years in Midian weren't missing at all. They were hidden, protected, set apart for a purpose so significant that they required complete separation from the distractions and compromises of ordinary life. During those decades of apparent obscurity, the greatest leader in biblical history was being forged in the furnace of divine preparation. Every day of shepherding, every night of desert solitude, every lesson learned from Jethro, every moment of communion with God was contributing to a transformation that would affect the course of human history. The shocking truth about Moses' missing years isn't that they were wasted in exile. It's that they were the most productive period of preparation ever recorded. The man who would give the world the 10 Commandments, establish the sacrificial system that pointed toward Christ, and become the archetype of faithful leadership was shaped not in the palaces of Egypt, but in the wilderness of Midian. Those 40 years of silence were actually 40 years of the most intensive divine education ever provided to a human being, and the results speak for themselves. The Exodus, the law, the wilderness wanderings, the conquest preparations, all of these world-changing events flowed from the foundation laid during those crucial decades of hidden preparation. Moses didn't just survive his exile in Midian. He was transformed by it into exactly the leader God needed for the most challenging assignment in biblical history. The next time you read the account of Moses confronting Pharaoh or receiving the law on Mount Sinai, remember that none of it would have been possible without those 40 years of comprehensive preparation. The missing years weren't missing. They were essential. They were purposeful. They were the secret to everything that followed. And they proved that God's timing is always perfect, even when it requires decades of preparation that seem to accomplish nothing but actually accomplish everything. The 40 years of wilderness wandering that followed weren't just a consequence of Israel's disobedience at Kadesh Barnea. They were the final phase of Moses' education, a graduate-level course in leading a stubborn people through impossible circumstances while maintaining unwavering faith in divine promises. Every crisis that arose during those decades tested a different aspect of the wisdom Moses had gained during his Midian preparation. Consider the rebellion of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. This wasn't just a political challenge to Moses' authority. It was a spiritual assault on the very foundation of theocratic leadership. The rebels questioned whether Moses had any special calling from God, whether his authority was legitimate, whether the people needed any mediator between themselves and the Almighty. These weren't new questions for Moses. He had wrestled with similar doubts about his own worthiness during his early years in Midian. But Moses' response to this rebellion demonstrates the depth of security he had developed through decades of intimate relationship with God. Instead of defending himself through political maneuvering or personal charisma, he simply appealed to divine vindication. Tomorrow the Lord will show who belongs to him and who is holy. He declared with the quiet confidence of a man who had learned to let God fight his battles. The earth opening to swallow the rebels wasn't just divine judgment. It was confirmation of everything Moses had learned about God's character during his desert years. The same God who had provided water from rocks and manna from heaven could also demonstrate his holiness through supernatural judgment. Moses' lack of surprise at this miraculous intervention reveals how thoroughly his Midian experiences had prepared him to expect divine action in response to human rebellion. The bronze serpent incident provides another window into the practical wisdom Moses had gained during his shepherding years. When venomous snakes began attacking the people because of their complaints against God, Moses didn't panic or try to organize a snake hunting expedition. Instead, he inquired of the Lord and received instructions to craft a bronze serpent and mount it on a pole. Anyone who looked at this bronze serpent after being bitten would live. This solution would have seemed absurd to most leaders, but Moses understood something profound about divine methodology from his Midian training. God often works through symbols that appear contradictory to human logic, but carry deep spiritual significance. The bronze serpent represented both the judgment the people deserved and the salvation God provided. Looking at it required an act of faith that acknowledged both guilt and dependence on divine mercy. The water crisis at Meribah, late in the wilderness wandering, reveals both the strengths and limitations of Moses' preparation. When the people complained about lack of water yet again, Moses' patience finally reached its breaking point. Instead of speaking to the rock as God had commanded, he struck it twice with his rod, declaring in frustration, "Must we bring water out of this rock for you rebels?" This moment of failure wasn't a negation of Moses' 40 years of preparation. It was a demonstration that even the most thoroughly prepared leader remains human and susceptible to the accumulated weight of dealing with difficult people over extended periods. The consequence was severe. Moses would not be permitted to enter the Promised Land. But it also revealed God's commitment to perfect justice, even when dealing with his most faithful servants. Yet even this failure became part of Moses' ongoing education. The humility he displayed in accepting God's judgment, his continued faithful service despite being denied his greatest earthly desire, and his gracious preparation of Joshua to succeed him, all demonstrate the depth of character that had been developed through decades of divine training. The man who had once acted impulsively in striking down the Egyptian had learned to submit even painful discipline with remarkable grace. The blessing of the 12 tribes that Moses pronounced before his death represents the culmination of his prophetic development. Each tribe received words perfectly suited to their character, calling, and future destiny. This wasn't just poetic inspiration. It was the fruit of 40 years spent observing human nature, understanding family dynamics, and learning to discern spiritual qualities that would manifest across generations. Moses' ability to see into the future and pronounce accurate prophetic blessings hadn't developed overnight. It was the result of decades spent in communion with the God who knows the end from the beginning. The Midian years had taught Moses to recognize divine patterns, to understand how character traits translate into historical destinies, and to serve as a channel through which heavenly wisdom could flow to earthly recipients. The final glimpse we get of Moses' Midian preparation comes in his death scene on Mount Nebo. At 120 years old, his eye was undimmed and his vigor unabated. This wasn't just good genetics or lucky longevity. It was the fruit of a life lived in perfect harmony with divine purposes. The discipline, the outdoor lifestyle, the spiritual vitality, and the sense of completed calling that had been cultivated during his desert years sustained him through 4 decades of the most challenging leadership assignment in human history. When Moses viewed the Promised Land from Mount Nebo before his death, he wasn't looking at unfamiliar territory. His shepherding years had taken him throughout this region. He knew the valleys, the mountains, the water sources, and the strategic locations that would prove crucial for Israel's conquest and settlement. Even in death, his Midian preparation was serving God's purposes by providing him with intimate knowledge of the inheritance his people were about to receive. The mourning period that followed Moses' death lasted 30 days, but the impact of his life continues to this day. The law he mediated, the precedents he established, the model of leadership he demonstrated, and the prophetic promises he declared all flow from the foundation laid during those 40 crucial years in Midian. Every major accomplishment of his public ministry can be traced back to principles, skills, or character qualities that were developed during his time with Jethro's family in the wilderness. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Moses' Midian years is how they demonstrate God's ability to use any circumstances, no matter how unpromising, to accomplish his ultimate purposes. What appeared to be exile and failure became the very means through which the greatest leader in biblical history was prepared for his calling. The years that seemed wasted were actually the most productive period of preparation ever recorded. This principle extends far beyond Moses' unique situation. Throughout biblical history, God consistently uses periods of apparent obscurity to prepare his servants for moments of significant impact. David's years as a shepherd boy prepared him for kingship. Paul's time in Arabia equipped him for apostolic ministry. Jesus himself spent 30 years in relative obscurity before beginning his public ministry. The pattern is clear. Divine preparation often requires extended periods away from public attention, times when character is being formed, skills are being developed, and spiritual sensitivity is being refined. These seasons may appear unproductive to external observers, but they're actually the foundation upon which all future effectiveness is built. Moses' missing years in Midian weren't an interruption of his calling. They were the fulfillment of it. Every day spent tending sheep was preparation for shepherding people. Every night of solitude under desert stars was communion that would sustain him through decades of public pressure. Every lesson learned from Jethro was wisdom that would prove essential for governing a nation. The shocking truth isn't that Moses wasted 40 years in exile. It's that those 40 years were the most important period of his entire life. Without them, there would have been no Exodus, no law, no wilderness journey, and no foundation for everything that would follow in Israel's history. The missing years weren't missing at all. They were the secret to everything else. When you understand what really happened during Moses' time in Midian, it changes how you view every season of preparation in your own life. Those periods when nothing seems to be happening, when your gifts appear to be wasted, when your calling seems delayed, may actually be the most crucial times of development you'll ever experience. God may be preparing you for something far greater than you can imagine, something that requires exactly the kind of comprehensive preparation that only extended seasons of apparent obscurity can provide. The man who confronted Pharaoh and delivered Israel wasn't born that way. He was made that way through 40 years of divine education in the wilderness of Midian. The missing years were actually the making of Moses, and they prove that God's timing is always perfect, even when it requires decades of preparation that transform ordinary people into extraordinary leaders. But there's one final aspect of Moses' Midian years that most people never consider, something that reveals the true depth of divine preparation and planning that went into shaping the deliverer of Israel. During those 4 decades in the wilderness, Moses wasn't just being prepared individually. He was being woven into a network of relationships and alliances that would prove crucial for everything that followed. The marriage to Zipporah wasn't just a personal relationship. It created kinship bonds between Moses and the Midianite tribes that would have far-reaching strategic implications. When the Israelites later traveled through Midianite territory during their wilderness wanderings, they weren't moving through hostile foreign lands. They were passing through regions where Moses had family connections, where his reputation as Jethro's son-in-law provided diplomatic protection. Consider how this relationship manifested during the Exodus itself. When Pharaoh's army was pursuing the fleeing Israelites, Moses knew exactly where to find safe passage through terrain that would have been treacherous for inexperienced travelers. His intimate knowledge of desert routes, water sources, and defensive positions wasn't just personal survival information. It was military intelligence that proved essential for protecting millions of people during their escape from Egypt. The Midianite metalworking skills that Moses observed and likely participated in during his exile also proved crucial later. When God gave instructions for constructing the tabernacle with its intricate bronze and gold work, Moses wasn't hearing about unfamiliar techniques. He was receiving specifications for craftsmanship he had witnessed firsthand during his years with Jethro's people. The artistic vision required to oversee the tabernacle's construction flowed naturally from decades of exposure to skilled artisans. But perhaps most significantly, Moses' time in Midian had connected him to trade networks and information systems that spanned the ancient Near East. The Midianites were merchants and traders who maintained relationships throughout the region. Through these connections, Moses would have gained intelligence about political developments in Egypt, military movements of neighboring nations, and economic conditions that would affect any large-scale population movement. This network of relationships also provided Moses with credibility among desert tribes that the Israelites would encounter during their wilderness journey. He wasn't a complete outsider trying to negotiate passage through foreign territory. He was someone who understood tribal customs, spoke the local languages, and had demonstrated his ability to live peacefully among nomadic peoples for decades. The depth of Moses' integration into Midianite society is revealed by Jethro's visit to the Israelite camp after the Exodus. This wasn't just a family reunion. It was a diplomatic mission from a significant tribal leader who wanted to observe firsthand what his son-in-law had accomplished. Jethro's declaration that, "Now I know that the Lord is greater than all the gods," wasn't just personal testimony. It was an official acknowledgement from Midianite leadership that Moses' God was supreme. This diplomatic recognition had enormous implications for Israel's future relationships with neighboring peoples. The Midianites' acceptance of Moses' divine commission provided legitimacy for his leadership that extended far beyond the Hebrew community. Other tribal leaders throughout the region would have taken notice when Jethro, a respected priest and ruler, publicly endorsed Moses' mission. The administrative council that Jethro provided for organizing Israel's judicial system also reveals the sophistication of the governmental structures Moses had been exposed to during his Midian years. The system of judges over thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens wasn't a theoretical construct. It was a proven organizational model that had been successfully implemented in Midianite society for generations. Moses' immediate acceptance and implementation of Jethro's suggestions demonstrates how thoroughly he had internalized Midianite approaches to governance and administration. He didn't need time to understand or adapt these foreign concepts because they weren't foreign to him. They were familiar structures that he had observed and participated in for 4 decades. Even the location where Moses received the law takes on new significance when you understand his Midian connections. Mount Sinai wasn't just a random wilderness location. It was a sacred site that had been significant to Midianite religious practices for generations. Moses' first encounter with God at the burning bush had occurred on this same mountain, suggesting that it had been a place of worship and spiritual significance throughout his desert years. The fact that God chose to give the law at a location that was already meaningful to Moses and familiar to the Midianite peoples demonstrates the careful integration of divine purposes with existing cultural and religious frameworks. This wasn't divine disruption of human institutions. It was divine fulfillment of preparations that had been developing for decades. The trumpet blast that accompanied God's descent on Mount Sinai would have been recognized by Moses as similar to signals used in Midianite tribal gatherings and religious ceremonies. The thunder, lightning, and earthquake that terrified the Israelites were manifestations of divine power that Moses had been prepared to interpret through his years of exposure to Midianite traditions about divine revelation. As Moses ascended into the thick darkness where God was, he was drawing on spiritual disciplines and practices that had been developed during his Midian years. The courage required to approach divine holiness, the faith needed to trust in God's protective presence, and the humility necessary to receive divine instruction had all been cultivated through decades of intimate communion with the Almighty in the wilderness. The 2 40-day periods Moses spent on Mount Sinai receiving the law weren't just extended dictation sessions. They were the culmination of 40 years of spiritual preparation, moments when everything he had learned about divine human communication was being put to its ultimate test. The stone tablets he carried down the mountain represented not just divine commands, but the tangible result of decades of training in serving as a mediator between heaven and earth. When Moses' face began shining with divine glory after these encounters, it was the visible manifestation of a transformation that had been occurring gradually throughout his Midian years. The spiritual sensitivity required to reflect divine radiance had been developed through decades of regular communion with God in the desert wilderness. The veil that Moses wore to shield the people from this reflected glory also demonstrates the practical wisdom he had gained about managing human responses to divine manifestations. His years among the Midianites had taught him how to bridge the gap between sacred and secular, how to make divine truth accessible to people who couldn't handle direct exposure to heavenly realities. As the Israelites prepared to leave Mount Sinai and continue their journey toward the Promised Land, Moses stood before them as more than just their political and religious leader. He was the living embodiment of 40 years of comprehensive preparation, a man who had been shaped by divine providence through every experience of his Midian exile. The staff in his hand wasn't just a symbol of authority, it was a tool he had used daily for 4 decades, transformed by divine power into an instrument of miraculous intervention. The words he spoke weren't just political rhetoric. They were the overflow of decades spent in communion with the God who had called him from the burning bush. The confidence with which Moses approached the challenges ahead wasn't based on personal ability or human wisdom. It was rooted in 40 years of discovering God's faithfulness in impossible circumstances, of learning to trust divine guidance when human logic suggested different approaches, of understanding that apparent setbacks often hide divine purposes. The missing years in Midian had accomplished something that no amount of formal education or political experience could have provided. They had transformed an impulsive Egyptian prince into a patient Hebrew shepherd, a man who understood both the heart of God and the needs of people, someone who could bridge the gap between divine holiness and human frailty. Every challenge that lay ahead, the wilderness wanderings, the rebellions, the military campaigns, the administrative crises, would draw on resources that had been developed during those 4 decades of apparent exile. The man who would guide Israel through 40 years of wilderness journey had been prepared through 40 years of wilderness living. The shocking truth about Moses' missing years isn't that they were lost time, it's that they were the most productive period of preparation in biblical history. Every day mattered. Every lesson learned was essential. Every moment of seeming insignificance was actually building towards something of eternal significance. Those weren't missing years at all. They were the making of Moses, the shaping of a deliverer, the preparation of the greatest leader in biblical history. And they prove that God's ways of developing his servants often require extended seasons of obscurity that accomplish far more than any amount of public recognition or formal training ever could. The next time you find yourself in a season that seems unproductive, remember Moses' 40 years in Midian. The time you think is being wasted may actually be the most important preparation period of your entire life. God may be shaping you for something far greater than you can imagine, something that requires exactly the kind of comprehensive development that only extended seasons of apparent exile can provide. The missing years weren't missing. They were essential. They were purposeful. They were the secret to everything that followed. And they demonstrate that divine timing is always perfect, even when it requires decades of preparation that seem to accomplish nothing but actually accomplish everything. But even as Moses stood poised to lead Israel into their greatest adventures and their deepest failures, there was one more layer to his Midian preparation that would prove absolutely crucial in the years ahead. You see, during those 4 decades in the wilderness, Moses hadn't just been learning about sheep and desert survival. He had been developing something far more precious and far more rare, the ability to intercede. Think about it. A shepherd spends countless hours alone with his thoughts, his prayers, and his relationship with the Almighty. Night after night, under the vast canopy of desert stars, Moses had learned to commune with God in ways that went far beyond formal religious rituals. He had discovered the secret of intimate conversation with the Creator, the kind of deep spiritual fellowship that transforms a man's heart and gives him access to divine mercy. This wasn't theoretical knowledge about prayer. This was 40 years of practical experience in bringing the needs of vulnerable creatures before the throne of heaven. Every sick lamb that needed healing, every threat that required divine protection, every moment of drought when water seemed impossible to find had taught Moses something essential about the heart of God toward those who depend on him completely. The intercession that Moses would later offer for the rebellious Israelites wasn't a skill he developed overnight. It was the natural overflow of decades spent pleading with God for the welfare of creatures under his care. The passionate prayers that would turn away divine wrath from a stiff-necked people flowed from a heart that had been trained through years of shepherding to value every life entrusted to his protection. Consider the golden calf incident again, but this time focus on Moses' response after his initial anger had subsided. When he climbed back up Mount Sinai to intercede for the people, his prayer revealed depths of love and sacrifice that could only have been developed through extensive experience in caring for vulnerable beings. If you will forgive their sin, good. But if not, please blot me out of your book, he pleaded with God. This wasn't the desperate bargaining of a politician trying to save his constituency. This was the heart cry of a shepherd who had learned that true leadership means being willing to sacrifice everything for the welfare of those under your care. 40 years of protecting sheep from wolves, lions, and bears had taught Moses that sometimes the shepherd must risk his own life to save his flock. The pattern of Moses' intercession throughout the wilderness wanderings reveals the depth of this preparation. When the people complained about manna and God sent quail along with a plague, Moses immediately began interceding for relief. When Miriam was struck with leprosy for speaking against his leadership, Moses cried out for her healing. When the earth opened to swallow Korah's rebellion, Moses and Aaron fell on their faces to prevent God's wrath from consuming the entire congregation. Every instance of intercession drew on reserves of spiritual authority that had been accumulated during those quiet years in Midian. The boldness required to approach the throne of the most holy God with requests for mercy. The persistence needed to continue pleading when initial prayers seemed unanswered, and the wisdom necessary to know how to frame appeals that would touch the heart of heaven, had all been developed through decades of shepherding experience. But there's something even more remarkable about Moses' intercessory preparation that most people completely overlook. During his years in Midian, Moses had been learning not just how to pray for others, but how to carry their burdens in ways that went beyond mere sympathy. The weight of responsibility for vulnerable lives had been gradually building his spiritual capacity to bear loads that would crush most people. When Numbers tells us that Moses was very humble, more than all men who were on the face of the earth, it's describing a character quality that had been forged through 4 decades of serving others with no recognition, no applause, and no earthly reward. The humility required for effective intercession isn't just about thinking less of yourself. It's about being so secure in God's love that you can absorb criticism, handle ingratitude, and continue serving even when people turn against you. The complaints and rebellions that Moses faced during the wilderness wanderings would have destroyed most leaders, but his Midian years had prepared him for exactly these challenges. He had learned that sheep bite the hand that feeds them, wander away from the shepherd who protects them, and forget the care they've received as soon as new difficulties arise. Human nature wasn't a shock to Moses because he had been observing similar patterns in animal behavior for decades. This preparation also explains Moses' remarkable ability to distinguish between different types of rebellion and respond appropriately to each one. When the people complained about food or water, he interceded with patience and compassion. When individuals challenged his God-given authority, he appealed for divine vindication. When the nation as a whole turned to idolatry, he combined righteous anger with sacrificial love in ways that brought both judgment and restoration. The wisdom required to make these distinctions hadn't been downloaded from heaven in a moment of inspiration. It had been developed through years of practical experience in managing the complex dynamics of creatures who were simultaneously dependent and rebellious, grateful and ungrateful, trusting and suspicious. Every day spent with the flocks had been preparation for handling the far more complex challenges of leading human beings. The bronze serpent incident reveals another dimension of Moses' intercessory preparation. When venomous snakes began attacking the people, Moses didn't just pray for the attacks to stop. He interceded for a solution that would require the people to participate in their own healing by looking in faith at the bronze serpent he constructed, according to divine instructions. This approach demonstrated wisdom that went far beyond crisis management. Moses understood from his shepherding years that lasting solutions often require the active participation of those being helped. Just as sheep must choose to follow their shepherd to water and safety, the people needed to exercise faith in God's provision, rather than simply receiving passive rescue from their difficulties. The depth of Moses' intercessory heart is perhaps most clearly revealed in his final prayer for Israel, recorded in Deuteronomy 32. This isn't just a blessing pronounced over the tribes, it's a prophetic intercession that spans generations, acknowledging both the failures that would come and the ultimate restoration that God would provide. The scope and insight of this prayer reflect decades of learning to see beyond immediate circumstances to God's eternal purposes. Moses' ability to bless even while pronouncing judgment, to declare hope even while acknowledging failure, and to intercede for future generations even while dealing with present rebellion, all flow from the spiritual maturity that had been developed during his Midian years. The man who could look beyond Israel's immediate disobedience to their ultimate destiny had learned this perspective through years of caring for creatures who often seemed determined to destroy themselves. The final test of Moses' intercessory preparation came when God told him he would die without entering the Promised Land. His response reveals the complete transformation that had occurred during those 40 years in the wilderness. Instead of bargaining for personal exemption or complaining about unfair treatment, Moses' primary concern was for the welfare of the people he was leaving behind. Let the Lord, the God of spirits of all flesh, appoint a man over the congregation, Moses prayed, so that the congregation of the Lord will not be like sheep without a shepherd. Even in his moment of greatest personal disappointment, his heart remained focused on the needs of those under his care. This wasn't just noble leadership. It was the natural response of a man whose identity had been completely shaped by 40 years of shepherding experience. The commissioning of Joshua that followed demonstrates the practical wisdom Moses had gained about succession planning. He didn't just announce his replacement and disappear. He publicly transferred authority in ways that gave Joshua legitimacy, provided him with divine endorsement, and prepared the people to accept new leadership. This careful transition process reflected decades of experience in managing change within communities that resist unfamiliar authority. When Moses climbed Mount Nebo for his final earthly assignment, he carried with him the accumulated weight of 40 years spent interceding for others. Every prayer offered during his shepherding years, every moment of communion with God in the wilderness, every lesson learned about divine mercy and human need had prepared him for this ultimate act of intercession, dying in place of entering the land so that his sin would not contaminate the inheritance God was giving his people. The view of the promised land that God showed Moses from Mount Nebo wasn't just a consolation prize for a faithful servant. It was the final answer to decades of intercessory prayer. Moses was seeing the fulfillment of promises he had pleaded for throughout his wilderness years, the realization of hopes he had carried during countless nights of watching over flocks and communing with heaven. His death at 120 years, with undiminished strength, wasn't just a remarkable physical phenomenon. It was the natural result of a life spent in perfect harmony between earth and heaven, between human responsibility and divine grace, between caring for immediate needs and trusting eternal purposes. The intercessory heart that had been developed during his Midian years had sustained him through every challenge and brought him to this moment of ultimate victory. The 30-day mourning period that followed Moses' death wasn't just ritual grieving. It was the nation's recognition that they had lost more than a political leader or military commander. They had lost their primary intercessor, the man who had stood between them and divine judgment countless times, who had carried their burdens before the throne of heaven with a consistency and effectiveness they would never see again. But the impact of Moses' intercessory ministry didn't end with his death. The priesthood he had established, the sacrificial system he had implemented, and the pattern of mediation he had modeled all continued to provide access to divine mercy for generations to come. Every priest who offered sacrifices for the people, every prayer lifted up in the tabernacle, every moment of communion between heaven and earth bore the mark of Moses' intercessory preparation. The missing years in Midian had accomplished something that no formal theological education could have provided. They had shaped a heart capable of bearing the spiritual weight of an entire nation, a man who could stand between divine holiness and human sinfulness without being crushed by either. The quiet decades of shepherding had been the perfect preparation for a lifetime of intercession that would affect eternity. Those 40 years weren't missing from Moses' story. They were the foundation of everything that made his story possible. Every prayer he would later offer, every moment of intercession that would turn away divine wrath, every act of mediation that would preserve God's people, flowed from wells that had been dug during those seemingly unproductive decades in the wilderness. The shocking truth about Moses' missing years isn't that they were wasted in exile. It's that they were the most spiritually productive period in biblical history. The time when the greatest intercessor who ever lived was being prepared for a ministry that would echo through eternity. Those years of apparent obscurity were actually years of the most intensive spiritual preparation ever recorded. And they prove once again that God's ways of developing his servants are often completely opposite to human expectations. The man who would become Israel's greatest intercessor was prepared not through advanced religious education or formal ministerial training, but through 40 years of caring for sheep in the wilderness. The missing years weren't missing at all. They were the secret to everything that followed, the hidden foundation that supported the most remarkable leadership ministry in human history. When you understand what really happened during Moses' time in Midian, it transforms how you view every season of apparent insignificance in your own life. Those periods when you feel forgotten, when your gifts seem unused, when your calling appears delayed, may actually be the most crucial times of preparation you'll ever experience. God may be developing in you the kind of intercessory heart that can only be formed through extended seasons of faithful service in obscurity. The missing years weren't missing. They were essential. They were purposeful. They were the making of Moses. And they demonstrate that the greatest servants of God are often prepared through the longest seasons of hidden faithfulness. What appears to be delay may actually be divine preparation for something far more significant than anything you could imagine. The final revelation about Moses' missing years comes through understanding something that most Bible readers completely overlook. Those 4 decades weren't just about personal preparation or individual transformation. They were about positioning Moses at the exact center of a divine conspiracy that had been unfolding since the promises made to Abraham. You see, Midian wasn't chosen randomly as Moses' place of exile. The Midianites were descendants of Abraham through Keturah, which means Moses was being placed among his own extended family without even realizing it. These weren't foreign strangers who happened to take him in. They were distant cousins who carried the same covenant blood, who remembered the same promises, who worshipped the same God their forefather Abraham had served. This family connection explains why Jethro took such immediate interest in Moses, why he was so quickly accepted into the inner circle of Midianite leadership, and why his marriage to Zipporah was welcomed rather than viewed as an unwelcome intrusion. Moses wasn't just finding refuge among nomads. He was being reconnected with branches of his family tree that had been separated for generations. But there's something even more profound happening here that reveals the true genius of divine timing. During those same 40 years that Moses was being prepared in Midian, something else was occurring in Egypt, that would prove absolutely crucial for the exodus that lay ahead. The Hebrew population was exploding at rates that defied natural explanation. When Jacob's family first entered Egypt during the famine, they numbered 70 people. By the time of the Exodus, conservative estimates placed the Hebrew population at over 2 million. This kind of population growth over 4 centuries requires supernatural blessing, and it was happening precisely during the period when their future deliverer was being prepared to lead them. Think about the timing. If Moses had attempted his rescue mission as a young man, there wouldn't have been enough Hebrews to form a significant nation. If he had waited longer, the population might have become so large that movement would have been impossible. The 40 years of his preparation corresponded exactly to the time needed for his people to reach the optimal size for both exodus and conquest. But the population growth was only part of what was happening during Moses' missing years. Archaeological evidence suggests that during this same period, Egypt was experiencing internal upheavals that would weaken the empire and make the eventual Hebrew departure possible. Political instability, economic challenges, and military pressures from neighboring nations were all combining to create conditions that would favor a massive slave exodus. The Pharaoh who would eventually face Moses wasn't the same kind of ruler who had originally welcomed Joseph's family into Egypt. By the time Moses returned, Egypt was ruled by insecure tyrants who saw the growing Hebrew population as a threat rather than an asset. Their increasing oppression wasn't just cruelty for its own sake. It was the desperate reaction of a weakening empire trying to maintain control over a people group that was becoming too large and too prosperous to ignore. During Moses' Midian years, these political pressures were building toward exactly the kind of crisis that would make divine intervention both necessary and effective. The timing wasn't coincidental. Every year of Moses' preparation corresponded to another year of increasing tension that would eventually explode into the confrontation between Pharaoh and the God of Israel. The trade routes that connected Midian with Egypt also played a crucial role during this period. Information flowed along these commercial pathways, bringing Moses regular updates about conditions in his homeland. He wasn't isolated from developments in Egypt. Through Midianite merchants and traders, he was receiving a constant stream of intelligence about the growing oppression of his people and the increasing instability of Egyptian leadership. This information network explains why Moses seemed so well informed about Egyptian conditions when he finally returned. His knowledge of Pharaoh's character, his understanding of Egyptian religious practices, and his insight into the political dynamics of the court weren't based on outdated memories from 40 years earlier. They were current intelligence gathered through 4 decades of careful observation and strategic information gathering. The metals and craftsmanship skills that Moses observed during his Midian years also take on new significance when you understand what was happening in Egypt during this same period. The Egyptians were becoming increasingly dependent on foreign expertise for their major construction projects. The building programs that required Hebrew slave labor were actually revealing the decline of Egyptian technical capabilities. Moses' exposure to advanced metallurgy and engineering techniques during his exile meant that he returned to Egypt with knowledge that was superior to what the Egyptians themselves possessed. The tabernacle construction that would later require such precise craftsmanship wasn't beyond the capabilities of the people Moses was leading, because their leader had spent 40 years learning these skills from master craftsmen. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of divine timing during Moses' missing years involves something that most people never consider: the spiritual preparation of the Hebrew people themselves. While Moses was learning to hear God's voice in the Midian wilderness, his people were crying out to heaven from Egyptian bondage in ways that were preparing them to recognize divine intervention when it finally arrived. The oppression that intensified during Moses' absence wasn't just political persecution. It was spiritual preparation that was breaking down Hebrew self-reliance and creating the kind of desperate dependence on God that would be necessary for them to follow their deliverer into an uncertain wilderness future. The people who would eventually leave Egypt weren't the same comfortable immigrants who had originally settled there. They were an oppressed nation ready for radical change. The timing of Moses' return also coincided with generational transitions among Hebrew leadership that would prove crucial for the success of his mission. The elders who remembered Joseph's era of influence had died during Moses' absence, leaving leadership roles open for men who had no investment in maintaining good relationships with Egyptian authorities. These newer leaders were ready for confrontation in ways that their predecessors might not have been. Even the natural cycles of the Nile River were aligning with divine purposes during this period. The plagues that would devastate Egypt required specific environmental conditions to achieve maximum impact. The timing of Moses' return coincided with natural patterns that would amplify supernatural judgments in ways that left no doubt about their divine origin. The military situation in the ancient Near East was also shifting in ways that favored Hebrew exodus during Moses' missing years. Egypt's traditional enemies were becoming more aggressive, forcing Pharaoh to divide his attention between internal control and external threats. This military pressure created opportunities for slave rebellion that wouldn't have existed during periods of Egyptian dominance. When Moses finally stood before the burning bush and received his commission to return to Egypt, every element necessary for successful deliverance had been perfectly positioned through 4 decades of divine orchestration. The deliverer was prepared, the people were ready, the political conditions were optimal, and the spiritual timing was perfect. The conversation between God and Moses at the burning bush takes on new meaning when you understand this comprehensive preparation. Moses' reluctance wasn't just personal insecurity. It was the response of someone who understood the magnitude of what God was proposing and recognized that success would require perfect coordination of countless variables that only divine wisdom could manage. God's assurance that he had already prepared every necessary element wasn't empty encouragement. It was the revelation of a plan that had been developing for 40 years, a strategy that had positioned every piece on the board in preparation for the greatest rescue mission in human history. The rod that would become Moses' instrument of miraculous power wasn't just a shepherd's staff transformed by divine blessing. It was a tool that had been in his hand for exactly the right amount of time to become an extension of his faith, a familiar object through which supernatural power could flow without disrupting the natural rhythms of his leadership style. As Moses prepared to leave Midian and return to Egypt, he was carrying more than personal preparation and divine commission. He was the culmination of 40 years of perfect timing, the focal point where decades of preparation would converge into world-changing action. Every skill learned, every relationship formed, every moment of spiritual development had been building toward this singular moment of destiny. The missing years weren't missing at all. They were the most precisely timed period of preparation in biblical history. 40 years when heaven and earth were being aligned for the most spectacular demonstration of divine power ever witnessed. Every day had mattered. Every lesson had been essential. Every moment had been moving toward the exodus that would define God's relationship with his chosen people forever. When Moses crossed the border from Midian back into Egypt, he wasn't just returning home. He was stepping into the culmination of the most comprehensive preparation program ever designed, ready to fulfill a destiny that had been 4 decades in the making. The shocking truth about his missing years was that they weren't missing at all. They were the secret to everything that followed, the hidden foundation that would support the most remarkable demonstration of divine faithfulness in human history. As Moses crossed back into Egyptian territory, carrying with him the weight of 4 decades worth of divine preparation, he embodied something that had never existed before in human history, a man perfectly equipped for an impossible task. But here's what makes this story even more extraordinary. The very people he was returning to save had no idea that their deliverance had been in preparation for longer than most of them had been alive. The Hebrew slaves crying out in Egyptian bondage weren't just suffering randomly. Their cries were the other half of a divine equation that had been building toward this moment of convergence. While Moses was learning to hear God's voice in the silence of the wilderness, his people were learning to call upon that same voice in the depths of their desperation. Two parallel preparations, one in solitude, one in suffering, both essential for what was about to unfold. But there's something even more remarkable about this divine timing that most people never realize. The Egypt that Moses was returning to wasn't just politically different from the one he had fled. It was spiritually ripe for the kind of supernatural confrontation that would expose the powerlessness of its entire religious system. The 40 years of Moses' absence had been 40 years of Egyptian spiritual decline, a gradual weakening of the occult foundations that would make their defeat all the more dramatic. The magicians who would later attempt to duplicate Moses' miracles weren't operating at full strength. The priestly orders that maintained Egypt's elaborate religious ceremonies had become increasingly dependent on ritual rather than power. The very foundations of Egyptian spirituality had been slowly eroding during the decades of Moses' preparation, setting the stage for a confrontation that would leave no doubt about which God was supreme. When Moses finally stood before Pharaoh and declared, "Let my people go," he wasn't just making a political demand. He was the culmination of the most comprehensive preparation program in human history, armed with supernatural authority that had been 40 years in the making, facing an empire that had been 40 years in spiritual decline. The outcome wasn't just victory, it was inevitability. The 10 plagues that followed weren't just random displays of divine power. They were the systematic dismantling of Egyptian religion by someone who understood both its strengths and its fatal weaknesses. Every miracle built upon the last, creating a crescendo of supernatural demonstration that left Egypt's gods exposed as powerless frauds before the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And through it all, Moses drew upon reserves of wisdom, patience, and spiritual authority that could only have been developed through those 4 transformative decades in Midian. The man who had once acted impulsively now moved with perfect timing. The prince who had once relied on human strength now operated in supernatural power. The fugitive who had once fled in fear now stood fearlessly before the most powerful ruler on earth. The exodus that followed was more than the liberation of a slave people. It was the vindication of divine timing, the demonstration that God's ways are higher than human ways, and the proof that apparent delays are often divine preparations. Moses' missing years weren't missing at all. They were the secret to everything that made him the greatest leader in biblical history. And here's the truth that should transform how you view every season of waiting in your own life. Those periods when nothing seems to be happening, when your calling appears delayed, when your gifts seem unused, may actually be the most crucial times of development you'll ever experience. God may be preparing you for something far greater than you can imagine, something that requires exactly the kind of comprehensive preparation that only extended seasons of apparent obscurity can provide. The man who delivered Israel from Egypt wasn't born ready for that task. He was made ready through 40 years of divine education in the wilderness of Midian. Those weren't lost years. They were the making of Moses, and they proved that God's timing is always perfect, even when it requires decades of preparation that seem to accomplish nothing but actually accomplish everything. So what does all of this mean for you today? As we reach the end of this incredible journey through Moses' hidden years, there's one final truth that emerges from the wilderness of Midian that could change everything about how you see your own life story. You see, Moses' transformation didn't happen because he was special or chosen in ways that don't apply to ordinary people. It happened because he surrendered to a process that most of us spend our entire lives trying to avoid. He allowed God to strip away everything that wasn't essential, to rebuild him from the ground up, to prepare him through seasons of obscurity for moments of destiny. The question is, are you willing to trust that same process in your own life? When you find yourself in seasons that feel like exile, when your dreams seem delayed beyond reason, when the calling you once felt so clearly appears to have gone silent, remember Moses in Midian. Remember that the greatest preparations often happen in the places where no one is watching, during the years when nothing seems to be happening. God is still writing stories of transformation in the wilderness places of our world. He's still taking broken people, forgotten people, people who think their best days are behind them, and preparing them for purposes they never could have imagined. The same God who spent 40 years making Moses into the deliverer of Israel is still at work today, still calling people out of their comfort zones and into seasons of preparation that will equip them for extraordinary callings. But here's what separates those who experience this transformation from those who miss it entirely: the willingness to embrace the process even when you can't see the purpose. Moses had no idea that his years of shepherding sheep were actually preparation for shepherding people. He couldn't have known that learning desert survival was equipping him to guide millions through the wilderness. He had no clue that the patience he was developing with stubborn animals was preparing him for the patience he would need with stubborn human beings. The missing years of Moses teach us that divine preparation rarely looks like what we expect. It's not found in the spotlight or on the platform. It's discovered in the daily faithfulness of obscure seasons, in the character that's forged when no one is applauding, in the intimate relationship with God that develops when all external validation is stripped away. If you're in a season right now that feels like Midian, if you're wondering why God seems silent when you thought you heard his voice so clearly before, if you're questioning whether the dreams he planted in your heart will ever come to pass, take courage from Moses' story. The wilderness isn't punishment. It's preparation. The waiting isn't wasted. It's essential. The silence isn't absence. It's the sound of something being forged in the depths that will one day shake the world. Those 40 missing years weren't missing at all. They were the most important years of Moses' entire existence, the secret foundation upon which everything else would be built. And your hidden years, your waiting seasons, your times of apparent insignificance may be the most crucial preparation of your entire life. The God who called Moses from the burning bush is still calling people today. He's still looking for those who are willing to spend decades in preparation for moments of impact. He's still transforming ordinary people in extraordinary ways through the patient work of time and testing. Don't despise the day of small beginnings. Don't rush the process of preparation. Trust that the same God who orchestrated every detail of Moses' transformation is orchestrating every detail of yours. The missing years in your story aren't missing. They're essential. And when your burning bush moment comes, you'll finally understand why every single day of preparation was absolutely necessary for everything that follows. The shocking truth about Moses' missing years in Midian is that they hold the key to understanding how God still works today. He's still calling, he's still preparing, he's still transforming lives in the hidden places. The question is, will you trust him with your wilderness seasons long enough to discover what he's preparing you for? Your exodus is coming. Your moment of destiny is being prepared even now. But first comes the wilderness. First comes the waiting. First comes the transformation that can only happen when you're alone with God in the places where no one else can see. The missing years weren't missing. They were the making of Moses, and they may be the making of you.